forger, whoever he was, simply chose to copy the conventional likeness. But what if the shroud were genuine?
I began to trace the likeness of Christ back through the centuries. The 15th century, the 14th century, the 13th century. Right back, in fact, as far as the 6th century, the likeness to the shroud image was quite unmistakable. But before this time, there was a surprising inconsistency. Many portraits of Christ were beardless. The Gospels give no indication of how Christ looked, so artists had no model to follow.
I wondered, what was it that had brought about this sudden, dramatic, definitive likeness in Christ's portraits from the 6th century on? Could it have been the shroud?
I found it intriguing that according to Eastern Christian tradition, this likeness was taken from the image on a strange and mysterious cloth found in the early 6th century, precisely where Max Fry showed the Turin shroud had once been, in southern Turkey.
The cloth was discovered here, in the southern Turkish town of Edessa, now known as Urfa, or perhaps we should say rediscovered. Edessa was the earliest, and at that time, one of the greatest eastern centers of Christianity. Cave tombs in the surrounding hillside were inhabited by thousands of hermits who came just to be close to the holy city. The citizens proudly claimed that Christianity in Edessa dated back to the very time of Jesus himself. They told the story of King Abgar V, who we know ruled in Edessa at the time of Christ. Now Abgar was stricken with a disease. Hearing of the miracles of Jesus, he wrote to him asking that he might come to Edessa and cure him. But Jesus did not come. In his place came a disciple named Addai, bearing with him a cloth, having a miraculous image of the Savior himself. Abgar was cured, and believing on Jesus, he brought Christianity to his city. Abgar was succeeded by his son Manu, who returned to the old pagan gods, and the persecuted Christians hastily hid the sacred cloth away. Around the year 525, probably during repairs to the city walls after a serious flood, in a niche high above the west gate, the cloth was rediscovered and described as bearing an image made without hands. It became so famous and coveted that at last the Emperor of Byzantium sent an army to lay siege to the city until the Edessans reluctantly handed over the sacred cloth. And so the Emperor, amid the great jubilation of his people, welcomed the cloth to Byzantium. Descriptions tell us the image appeared to be a moist secretion without coloring or artificial stain, extremely blurred, and not consisting of earthly colors. Its cause seemed due to sweat, not pigments. To this day, icon painters of the Eastern Church still base their work on copies of the Edessa cloth, which they consider to be the true likeness. Wilson felt sure that this cloth and the shroud were one and the same. But why was the Edessa cloth only shown as a portrait? Early copies seemed to show it stretched on a board and covered with an ornamental trellis. Wilson formulated this theory based on an early account that it had been doubled in four. This would have made it acceptable to King Abgar as a portrait, rather than grave clothes, which at the time of Jesus were considered untouchable. Thus the full-length image remained hidden for centuries. But where did it go from Constantinople? That question still remained. And how did it arrive at Lire in the hands of the Descharnay family? 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople was sacked and looted. The Edessa cloth simply disappeared. The French crusader Robert de Clary wrote that neither Greek nor Frenchman knew what became of it. So who came to possess it? Wilson has suggested one group of suspects with just the right qualities: powerful, fabulously rich, dealers in religious relics, and above all, obsessively secretive, the Crusader Order of Knights Templar. Strange rumors spread about them, which gave the French king the excuse he needed to destroy the order and lay his hands on their treasure. It was said that they worshipped a mysterious bearded male head, a charge which seemed inexplicable until a remarkable discovery made a few years ago in this quiet village in Somerset, England. Here in Templecombe, which was once an ancient Templar commandery, was found this painting, uncannily similar to the face on the shroud, and dating back to the times of the Templars. And there is one more crucial piece of evidence to strengthen this Templar connection. In 1314, the last Grand Master of the Templars was burned in Paris. Beside him in the flames perished one other man, and that man's name has a familiar ring. It was Geoffrey de Charnay, namesake of the other Geoffrey de Charnay, who some years later was responsible for the first expositions of the shroud at Lille. So, for the first time, Wilson had produced a chain of historical evidence which carried the shroud back to the one time and the one place it had to have been if it were genuinely the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And that chain of evidence was considerably strengthened when Max Fry finally completed his identification of all the pollens in his sample.
The pollen grains which confirm the presence of the shroud in Turkey were not all I had found. I had isolated many other specimens which I couldn't identify by the help of botanical textbooks. So I had to travel personally to such countries where the shroud might have been. It was quite natural to go first to Jerusalem and the surrounding wilderness of Judah. Here I found the answer. This plant is Sueda. In this particular variety, it is known only in Palestine. I found pollen from it on the shroud. And this here is Paganum harmala, a desert plant that is very frequent between Jericho and the Dead Sea. I found pollen from this plant too on the shroud.
Altogether, 8 of the species present on the shroud came from this area.
The presence of pollen from such plants growing exclusively in the land of the Bible and the surrounding deserts permits only one conclusion, that in some time of its history the shroud was exposed to the open air in Palestine.
It's difficult enough to believe that a medieval forgery could stand up so well to the kind of investigation we've seen already. But there is yet another characteristic of the image that only the most recent technology has been capable of detecting. Here, at the U.S. Air Force Academy, Colorado Springs, a professor of physics and a professor of engineering have coordinated an intensive research program into the nature of the image on the shroud. Dr. Eric Jumper and Dr. John Jackson.
As a scientist, when I became interested in the computer pictures sent back from the Mariner spacecraft near Mars, I thought that perhaps some of this technology could be applied to the shroud. So then when I was in Albuquerque, I started a rather modest attempt at this, and at that time I met Eric Jumper.
Well, the meeting that John refers to is about 3.5 years ago, and since that time we've made many interesting discoveries about the shroud. Right now we'd like to show you what we feel is one of the most interesting, and it involves the use of this machine. And we'd like to tell you exactly how it works. We already have 2 filters of different density lined up under the television camera that you see here. The television signal is then fed into our equipment, and you can see the filters displayed on our TV monitor.
And of course what you see are 2 squares of different shades of darkness. The television signal is processed by a VP8 image analyzer, which has the ability to translate the image patterns as adjustable levels of vertical relief on this monitor. Now watch what happens as I raise the relief. As you can see, the image intensity patterns are plotted as vertical relief in proportion to the amount of darkness that you see over here. I can also rotate the image and view it from various angles.
Now before we put a picture of the shroud under the camera, let me show you something. I have here an ordinary photograph of myself in mess dress, one which I'm sure my mother would be very proud of. And I'm going to put this under the camera. Now John is adjusting the gain in exactly the same way as he did with the squares. I'm sure you'll agree that even my mother would have trouble recognizing me there. Now the reason for this is very simple. A normal photograph records only variations in light and does not record information about the distance the camera was from the subject. Now we'll put a picture of the shroud under the camera.
As you can see, unlike the photograph of Eric, this image is clearly recognizable. This can only be explained if the intensity levels of the shroud image itself are encoded with distance information from the cloth to the body. There are 2 interesting features which are revealed by this 3-dimensional display. Firstly, there appears to be some kind of object which prevented an image from being formed. Note the depression around the face and the way the hair seems to drape over it. Even the beard appears to be divided by it. Perhaps this is the chin bandage.
And St. John also speaks of a napkin or sweat cloth or handkerchief that was over his head, or earlier described as round the face of Lazarus. And I think this is clearly functional. It was, as I understand it, a piece of cloth rather like this, which was then simply folded rather like a triangular bandage and made into a chin band, which would have been functionally necessary before rigor mortis set in to bind up the jaw in this sort of manner and tie over the top of the crown.
What we're now looking at is an image of the full body. We have an image of the front and one of the back. Of course, these are the burn marks, but what we're really interested in is the image between them. We see the head, the pectorals of the chest, the 2 arms, and the legs, with one knee slightly raised. What's interesting is that the knee is not raised well above the chest or the head, but it looks like it's in the correct dimensions. We see that the back also has the same characteristics, and we can even see a bit of roundedness in the calf.
When I first saw this image, I think I knew how Secunda Pia must have felt when, in 1898, he saw his photographic image. As scientists, we believe that it would be practically impossible for a forger, much less a medieval one, to have produced an image like this.
Yeah, he's a good medieval forger.
looked at all the evidence you and I have just seen and tried to assess it as carefully as I can, all I can say is that for me, at any rate, the burden of proof has shifted. I began by assuming its inauthenticity until proved otherwise and asking how, as a forgery, it could possibly have been done. I now tend to assume that it's authentic and still want to know how it was done. How on earth has this image been produced on the cloth?
Of course, this question is undoubtedly the most difficult to answer. How did the image get onto the cloth? Much of the research into this has been done in the USA, and Dr. Robinson visited Colorado to discuss the subject with Dr. Jackson, Dr. Jumper, and also Dr. Donald Lynn, supervisor of image enhancement at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, who began by summarizing the situation surrounding accurate scientific dating of the cloth.
The original carbon-14 dating technique required a significant amount of material to make an accurate measurement. In fact, to get the accuracy we'd like, it would require a significant portion of the shroud. But there are techniques under development now that can give an accuracy of the order of plus or minus 50 years with a few square centimeters of material.
The obvious first thought, I suppose, must be that it was by human hand, by some kind of painting. What do you say to that?
Well, if it was a painting, the artist would have had to use some sort of a pigment. The most likely pigment would have been an organic one.
You mean derived from plants and animals?
Exactly. Now, I think we can rule out an organic pigment. We know the cloth was exposed to a fire, and from the damage we can tell that it probably went through a very large variation in temperature. Then this would have been reflected in a change in the coloration of the organic pigment. So I think we can rule that one out, because we don't see that. And I think Don also did some work on the art.
Yeah, as part of our work, we did a frequency analysis on the image of the face. And the results of this analysis indicated that there was no directionality to the image.
You mean something like brush marks?
Yes, if it was done by a human hand, you would expect to have a preferential direction or directions, and not a random orientation as we see in our images.
Well, if it wasn't put on from the outside, could it have come from the body itself by some kind of exudation made from sort of sweat and aloes?
We know from simple experiments, for instance, if I had some blood here and laid a cloth over it,